On September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay lay in stunned silence. The guns had fallen quiet. The great carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet sat anchored like steel islands, and aboard the USS Missouri, the Japanese delegation signed away an empire. Yet as the ink dried on the surrender document, another story was already beginning, not one of bombs or blood, but of hunger, fear, and the unthinkable sight of American soldiers handing out food to the very civilians who had once been their sworn enemies. U.S. Navy Log, Sept. 2, 1945. In the weeks that followed Japan's capitulation, its cities resembled vast graveyards of rubble and smoke. Tokyo had been firebombed into ashes, its wooden homes charred into skeletons, its avenues littered with twisted bicycles and scorched tram rails. The war had stripped the nation of rice harvests, livestock and fishing fleets. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors of atomic fire wandered dazed, their skin burned, their stomachs hollow. Millions faced starvation. Estimates from the Allied occupation authorities warned that by the coming winter, 10 million Japanese could perish if nothing changed. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. American GIs, fresh from battlefields drenched in blood and sacrifice, entered these ruined cities with rifles slung low and bayonets sheathed. Civilians cowered at the sight. Rumors had spread like wildfire through the villages that Americans would loot, rape, or even slaughter in revenge for Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal. Mothers hid their daughters. Old men clutched bamboo spears. And yet on street corners and in dusty market squares, the impossible happened. Soldiers in olive-drab uniforms began reaching into their rucksacks, pulling out cans of Spam, Hershey bars, and powdered milk, and handing them, hesitantly at first, into the trembling hands of hungry children. Red Cross Field Report, Oct. 1945. For the Japanese civilians, it was disorienting. Just weeks earlier, every schoolbook, every radio broadcast had painted Americans as demons and barbarians who would burn their nation to the ground. The bombings seemed to prove it true. And yet, in the shattered aftermath, the victors extended rations instead of revenge. An eyewitness diary from a Tokyo schoolteacher described her astonishment. The soldier smiled as he gave the chocolate. My students wept, unable to understand kindness from an enemy. Bundesarchive translation, Occupation Records. To understand why these acts resonated so deeply, one must step back to the broader context of 1945. Japan's defeat had not been gradual, it was catastrophic. By the summer, the U.S. Navy's blockade had strangled imports of rice from Korea and Taiwan, oil from the Dutch East Indies, and fish from coastal waters. Allied submarines lurked offshore, sinking junks and barges carrying sacks of grain. By August, daily caloric intake for many civilians had dropped below 600 calories, barely subsistence level for an adult laborer. In cities like Osaka and Yokohama, food riots erupted, and black markets flourished where a single egg could cost a week's wages. U.S. Army Civil Affairs Report, AG 1945, and then came the bombings. On the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, Operation Meeting House unleashed 1,665 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo. Entire districts vanished in firestorms that consumed oxygen and suffocated tens of thousands. By dawn, 100,000 civilians lay dead and 1 million were homeless. The raids spread: Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama, all reduced to skeletal frameworks of chimneys and scorched earth. By war's end, an estimated 67 Japanese cities had been at least 50% destroyed. U.S. Army Air Force Mission Report 1945. The Japanese High Command, desperate to preserve morale, warned its people that the Americans would show no mercy if they invaded. Propaganda leaflets ordered civilians to prepare bamboo spears, suicide charges, even rocks to hurl at paratroopers. Families rehearsed mass suicide drills. Better to die with honor, the broadcast proclaimed, than live as slaves of the barbarian. Imperial Japanese radio broadcast, July 1945. But when the U.S. soldiers arrived, reality diverged from the terror. In Yokohama, children clutching bowls lined up outside U.S. kitchens as cooks ladled out surplus stew. In rural villages, army trucks offloaded sacks of wheat flour to bakeries, teaching Japanese millers how to bake Western bread to stretch dwindling rice. In Hiroshima, Navy medics treated burns alongside Japanese doctors, working in silence among the shadows of atomic ruins. Occupation Medical Report, Sept. 1945. The symbolism was profound. To the starving, a chocolate bar was more than food. It was proof that the enemy's hand could open in generosity rather than close in a fist. To the sick, a tin of powdered milk meant survival through another winter. To the broken society, these rations were a first crack in the wall of hatred built by years of war. U.S. Civil Relief Log, Oct. 1945. Of course, not every soldier was comfortable with the gesture. Many had fought brutal campaigns on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where fanatic resistance and kamikaze attacks had killed their comrades in horrific numbers. To hand food to civilians, the very people who had cheered those kamikazes, was not easy. Yet the policy came from the top. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, declared that rebuilding Japan would require not humiliation, but stability. "Give them food," he ordered, "and you give them hope. Hope is the first step to peace." MacArthur Papers, 1945. And so American supply chains that had once ferried bombs and bullets across the Pacific were redirected toward humanitarian aid. Liberty ships carried wheat from Kansas, corn from Iowa, and medical kits from New Jersey. Engineers who had designed amphibious landing craft now oversaw port reconstruction in Yokosuka. The same factories that had churned out tanks now sent tractors and plows to revive farming. For the Japanese, this reversal was almost incomprehensible. Warshipping Administration Report, Dec. 1945. In one memorable scene recorded in a civilian diary in Osaka, a small boy approached a group of soldiers and bowed deeply. He clutched in his hand a Hershey wrapper he had kept for weeks, its silver paper smoothed like treasure. He tried to return it to the soldier, saying in broken English, "Please, more for Mother." The soldier knelt, ruffled the boy's hair, and gave him another bar. For the onlookers, the moment carried the weight of a world turned upside down. Occupation Diary Translation, 1945. The larger question remained, was this kindness a fleeting gesture or the beginning of something greater? For centuries, Japanese culture had taught loyalty to the emperor, devotion to the nation, and suspicion of outsiders. Yet in the ruins of 1945, the simple act of sharing rations challenged that worldview. Could mercy rewrite the story of a defeated nation? Could chocolate and bread carry more power than bullets and bombs? The answer lay in what came next, as American policy shifted from battlefield conquest to occupation reform. The rations were only the first step. Behind them loomed larger strategies, political restructuring, economic rehabilitation, and a deliberate effort to reshape Japanese society itself. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers Directives, Oct. 1945. For the civilians who received those first cans of food, the future remained uncertain. They did not yet know that schools would be rebuilt, that farms would be revived, that democracy would be written into their constitution. All they saw was the paradox. The enemy who had destroyed their homes was now handing them survival. And as the autumn of 1945 darkened into winter, one question lingered in every cold, hungry street. Was this unexpected generosity a fragile illusion, or the first sign of a new Japan being forged in the ashes of surrender? The hidden advantage of the American presence in post-war Japan was not merely the overwhelming arsenal that had broken the empire, but the colossal logistical machine that kept the U.S. Army moving, fed and supplied across two oceans. When the guns fell silent, that machine was redirected almost overnight from destruction to preservation. And it was this transformation that bewildered both civilians and former Japanese officers. How could the same force that had reduced cities to rubble now conjure loaves of bread, milk powder, and vaccines on a scale their own empire had never matched? U.S. Army Service Forces Report, 1945. The secret lay in American logistics, its supply chains, ships, and technical ingenuity. The United States had mobilized its entire industrial base during the war, producing 297,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and more than 2.5 million military trucks. Yet beneath those headline numbers was the less glamorous but decisive achievement: food. At peak wartime production, American agriculture supplied over 100 million tons of grain annually, and wartime factories processed it into concentrated rations designed for soldiers fighting on remote islands. These C rations and K rations, though uninspiring to eat day after day, were engineered to last months in the tropics, survive parachute drops, and withstand saltwater spray. Quartermaster General Report 1945. When peace came, those same rations became life-saving aid for civilians. Spam canned pork shoulder mixed with ham had been shipped by Hormel Foods in staggering quantities since 1941. Soldiers grew tired of it, joking bitterly about ham that failed the physical. Yet in Japan, Spam became a luxury, its protein content far exceeding the meager rice gruel most families subsisted on. Technical Manual TM 10405, 1944. Hershey's Chocolate 2 had been redesigned during the war as a high-calorie D-ration bar, hard, bitter, and resistant to melting. To civilians, its sweetness was almost unbelievable after years of sugar rationing. Children clutched the foil wrappers long after the chocolate was gone, sometimes trading them like currency in the rubble of playgrounds. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps Archive 1945. Engineers played a role few civilians understood. The packaging technology developed by DuPont and Reynolds Metals ensured that tins and foil remained airtight for years. General Electric's advances in refrigeration units meant ships could carry perishables across the Pacific. The Liberty and Victory ships, produced at breakneck speed by the thousands during the war, now carried sacks of wheat from Midwestern elevators to Tokyo Bay. In the words of one former Japanese naval officer, recorded in an interrogation, "We thought America only made bombs. Then we saw their bread convoys. We could not comprehend such abundance." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogations 46. A decisive moment came in October 1945 in Yokohama when the first large-scale relief distributions were organized. U.S. Army trucks rolled into the city, carrying flour, canned meats, and powdered milk. The operation, planned like a battlefield campaign, involved precise schedules, military police escorts, and translators coordinating with local Japanese officials. Civilians gathered in cautious silence, expecting humiliation or harsh words. Instead, they saw disciplined soldiers unloading sacks as if preparing for combat. But the cargo was survival, not destruction. Occupation Civil Affairs Report OCT 1945. What astonished observers was the efficiency. American supply officers treated the feeding of civilians as seriously as fueling divisions in combat. Records from the 8th Army detail how daily tonnages were calculated, distribution centers mapped, and stockpiles guarded. Each district received quotas based on population. The system echoed the logistics of amphibious landings, where rations had to be landed under fire. Now that same precision fed women, children, and the elderly under a different kind of pressure, the clock of starvation. 8th Army Quartermaster Log, Nov 1945. Japanese reactions were conflicted. Diaries reveal deep shame at accepting food from the enemy, yet also astonishment at the scale. One Tokyo bureaucrat recorded, "They distribute with order, not arrogance. They calculate our mouths as if each were a soldier in their army. We once believed such enemies were demons. Today they appear as machines of mercy." Tokyo Municipal Diary Translation, Nov 1945. There were, inevitably, moments of tension. At Yokosuka, a crowd pressed too close, fearing supplies would run out. Soldiers raised their rifles in warning, but no shots were fired. Instead, the officers ordered extra trucks from reserve stock, ensuring the crowd dispersed with rations in hand. The lesson was deliberate. Discipline and abundance, not intimidation. Naval Occupation Log 1945. The technical detail of these rations fascinated engineers and historians alike. Their single sea ration meal weighed 1.2 pounds and provided 1,200 calories, beans with meat, crackers, soluble coffee, and a small candy. 3 meals sustained a soldier for a day at nearly 3,600 calories. For civilians accustomed to subsisting on half that intake, the rations seemed endless. In Osaka, Army nutritionists introduced fortified biscuits designed for malnourished children. Blending wheat flour, soybean protein, and vitamins A and D, these were baked in converted military field ovens, supervised by American food technicians, but staffed by Japanese bakers trained on site. Bureau of Public Health Nutrition Report 1946. One remarkable episode unfolded in Hiroshima, where Navy medical corpsmen distributed not just food, but penicillin, a drug still scarce even in the United States. Factories like Pfizer had scaled production dramatically during the war, and now the surplus vials arrived in shattered hospitals. For survivors suffering from burns and infections, the medicine seemed almost miraculous. A local nurse wrote, "They carried the same symbol on their sleeves as those who bombed us, yet their hands delivered life." Occupation Medical Diary. Hiroshima, 1945, for the Americans, the mission was not merely generosity. It was strategy. Intelligence officers noted the psychological impact of rations on morale. Hungry civilians could become desperate, fueling unrest, riots, or even guerrilla resistance. Feeding them reduced the chance of chaos. More importantly, it showed that the new order under Allied occupation was not built on terror, but on stability. As one Army intelligence memo concluded, "Every Hershey bar is worth a bullet not fired. Every loaf of bread is worth a riot not begun." G2 Intelligence Brief, Nov. 1945. Former Japanese soldiers returning from the front were perhaps the most conflicted. Many had fought on islands where surrender meant death, where Americans were portrayed as merciless executioners. Yet now they saw those same Americans kneeling to hand food to children. A dramatized composite account from a veteran in Nagano recalls, "We were told they would kill us. Instead, they saved our families." It was harder to understand than defeat itself. Dramatized composite. The broader battle was not fought with rifles but with perception. The United States knew it had to win Japanese trust, just as surely as it had won Midway or Okinawa. The arsenal of democracy that had built Sherman tanks and B-29 bombers now demonstrated its power in something subtler: logistics of mercy. And the Japanese, conditioned by years of propaganda, struggled to reconcile the sight. In December 1945, as snow blanketed the ruins of Tokyo, Army trucks delivered flour to neighborhood kitchens. Women who had once been ordered to sharpen bamboo spears now stirred soup made from American wheat. Children huddled around stoves powered by coal the Navy had brought in, and on their faces, for the first time in years, flickered something more than fear: relief. Supreme Commander Civil Supply Log, Dec 1945. Yet beneath this relief another question brewed: what did it mean for a proud, warlike nation to survive on the food of its conquerors? Would this mercy breed gratitude or deepen humiliation? The answer would determine whether Japan rose from the ashes as an ally, or simmered in resentment that could ignite again. The stage was set for a larger transformation, one that reached beyond rations into the soul of the nation itself. By the spring of 1946, the sight of American soldiers handing out food was no longer a shock. What had begun as isolated gestures in ruined marketplaces had become a coordinated national lifeline, feeding millions across a shattered archipelago. The immediate effect was survival. But the deeper impact, strategic, psychological, and cultural, was far more profound. It reshaped the very identity of a defeated empire. U.S. Civil Affairs Division Report, 1946. Strategically, the occupation authorities understood that hunger could destabilize their fragile control. Intelligence officers feared riots, black market uprisings, or even communist influence seeping into starving populations. Feeding civilians was not just mercy, it was a weapon of stability. Every ship carrying Kansas wheat or California milk powder across the Pacific was as vital as a battleship had been a year earlier. The logistics were staggering. Between 1945 and 1947, the United States shipped more than 800,000 tons of food to Japan. Grain elevators in the Midwest worked around the clock, loading boxcars bound for West Coast ports, where Liberty ships, veterans of Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf, were repurposed for humanitarian cargo. War Shipping Administration Relief Report, 1947. The psychological consequences, however, rippled in ways no general could have fully planned. Japanese civilians, conditioned by years of propaganda to believe Americans were monsters, now saw them kneeling to offer bread to their children. The dissonance was shattering. A young girl in Osaka, interviewed years later, recalled, "I expected them to strike us. Instead, they gave me chocolate. I could not hate them after that day." U.S. Army Oral History Project, 1953. This reversal undermined decades of militarist indoctrination. The emperor himself had told his subjects to endure the unendurable surrender. Now they were experiencing the unimaginable kindness of the conqueror. Imperial Rescript Translation, Aug. 1945. Former Japanese officers interrogated by occupation authorities admitted their astonishment. A colonel who had served in Manchuria confessed, "We taught our men to fight to the death because Americans would never spare us. And yet when defeat came, they spared everyone, and even fed our children. We could not understand." Allied Translator and Interpreter Section Interrogation File number 325. These realizations cut deeper than military defeat. They dismantled the myth of the invincible Japanese spirit by revealing that survival itself could come from mercy, not sacrifice. The engineers and workers behind the supply miracle rarely received recognition, but their role was decisive. American agronomists introduced hybrid seed strains to Japanese farmers, increasing rice yields. Food scientists developed fortified biscuits and vitamin-enriched flour, distributed through school programs. Engineers rebuilt port silos and train depots to handle imported wheat. In a symbolic moment in 1947, Japanese schoolchildren lined up not for military drills, but for a daily glass of milk, processed in plants once dedicated to producing munitions. U.S. Department of Agriculture Occupation Program Report, 1947. The transformation was technological as much as humanitarian. The contrast with Germany's occupation experience was instructive. Their resentment lingered longer, fueled by memories of World War I reparations. In Japan, however, the daily ritual of food aid softened hostility more rapidly. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded bluntly, "The provision of food was the most effective single act in stabilizing Japanese civilian morale." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Feeding the defeated, paradoxically, accelerated their willingness to accept democratic reforms imposed by MacArthur's headquarters. Culturally, the gesture redefined the meaning of surrender. In traditional Bushido ethos, defeat meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here survival was not only permitted, but sustained by the enemy. The national psyche began to shift from martial pride to pragmatic adaptation. A society once ready to hurl itself against invaders now embraced school lunches and breadlines as symbols of renewal. Japanese newspapers, initially wary of reporting American aid, gradually began publishing stories of nutrition drives, child health campaigns, and agricultural reforms. Each article eroded the demonization once preached over radio airwaves. Asahi Shimbun Archive, 1946. The legacy extended beyond food. The humanitarian aspect of occupation laid the groundwork for a political alliance. By 1951, as the Cold War tightened its grip on Asia, Japan signed the Treaty of San Francisco, aligning itself with the very power that had dropped atomic bombs on its cities. This alliance was possible because the emotional bridge had already been built in bread, chocolate, and milk powder. Civilians who had once feared annihilation now remembered the taste of American rations that had saved them from starvation. Treaty of San Francisco Proceedings, 1951. The psychological transformation echoed in personal testimonies. A dramatized composite account from a Hiroshima survivor illustrates this shift. "When the bomb fell, I thought America wanted us dead. When the soldier gave me food, I realized they wanted us to live. Between those two moments lies the end of war and the beginning of peace." Dramatized composite. Such moments resonated more deeply than policy directives or propaganda broadcasts. The human cost of this mercy was not ignored. American taxpayers funded billions of dollars in relief. Farmers in the Midwest complained of shortages at home, while their wheat sailed to feed former enemies. Dock workers in San Francisco and Los Angeles labored to load cargo holds with flour and canned goods, often unaware of their historical role in reshaping a nation's destiny. Engineers maintaining locomotives in Japan ensured trains carried grain instead of troops. Without their work, the narrative of survival would have faltered. U.S. General Accounting Office Relief Expenditure Summary, 1948. And yet, the impact on global strategy cannot be overstated. Feeding Japan ensured not only its survival, but its alignment against the Soviet Union. In Moscow, intelligence officers watched with suspicion as a defeated nation was revived under American guidance. The lesson was stark. Bread could be as powerful as bombs in the contest for post-war influence. CIA Early Cold War Briefing, 1947. The cultural memory endured long after the rations were gone. In the 1950s, American brands like Hershey and Spam became symbols of childhood for millions of Japanese, remembered with nostalgia rather than resentment. School programs institutionalized nutrition initiatives begun under occupation. The idea that the enemy could become a protector was woven into Japan's post-war pacifist identity. NHK Oral History Project 1962. Even decades later, veterans who had once fought bitterly on Pacific Islands recalled the paradox of those days. One Marine interviewed in 1980 said, "I never thought I'd see the day we'd hand out our rations to the very people who cheered when my buddies died. But when I watched a hungry kid eat my chocolate bar, I realized we hadn't just won a war, we had stopped another one from starting." Veterans History Project, Library of Congress. The closing chapter of this story is not about rations or chocolate bars, but about the lesson they carried. War had shown humanity's capacity for destruction. Tokyo in flames, Hiroshima in ruins, Nagasaki flattened. Yet the aftermath revealed something else: the power of mercy to rewrite the script of history. In the rubble of an empire, survival was extended not by swords or kamikazes, but by strangers offering food. In the words of a Japanese child's post-war essay, preserved in an Osaka school archive, "I was hungry and the soldier gave me bread. I thought he was my enemy, but that day he became my friend." Osaka School Archive, 1946. That line captures the essence of the transformation. Defeat became survival. Enemies became providers. And in the most unexpected of gestures, chocolate and bread carried the weight of peace more heavily than any bomb or bayonet. For in modern war, victory is not secured by destruction alone. It is sealed by the ability to rebuild what was broken, to feed the hungry, and to turn fear into trust.